Hi, and welcome to this How Do I video series about Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2016. In this video, I will explain how to configure SQL authentication in Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2016. At the end of this video, you will learn how to use new feature about configuration of SQL Server authentication between Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2016 server instance and Microsoft Dynamics NAV database in a single-tenant and multi-tenant environment. To enable this scenario, I need to complete these following steps. First, I need to set up an encryption key. Then, I will configure SQL Server authentication on database. After that, I will show you how to configure SQL authentication in single-tenant environment and also how to configure SQL authentication in multi-tenant environment. Let's start. First step is to set up an encryption key to encrypt the credentials, because Microsoft Dynamics NAV requires it when we use SQL Server authentication. We can do it using Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2016 administration shell commandlets. But if we do it for the first time, we can do it using Microsoft Dynamics NAV Server administration tool without any action. Now we will create and import encryption key using PowerShell commandlets. Run PowerShell ISC as administrator and then import NAV administration module. Now we need to create and import encryption key. I have already prepared script for it. First, we need to run new NAV encryption key command with keypath as folder we already created on our computer. Run only this line and type your credentials, username and password. And encryption key is created. We can check it on our folder. Now we need to import this encryption key using import NAV encryption key commandlet. Choose your server instance, just created encryption key, database server name and application database name. You can find all these details in Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2016 administration tool. In case you do it in multi-tenant environment, you need to use application database as application database name. Now I will mark these lines and run them. Again, we need to type our credentials, username and password we use to create encryption key. Click yes and everything is finished. We import an encryption key. Now we need to configure a Microsoft Dynamics NAV database to use SQL Server authentication with Microsoft NAV Server instance. Before we do it, we have to configure the SQL Server instance that hosts the Microsoft Dynamics NAV database to use SQL Server authentication. We need to choose Mixed Authentication mode, and we can do it using SQL Server Management Studio or using Transact SQL. More detail about it is shown here. If we use SQL Server Management Studio, we first need to create a new login that uses SQL Server authentication. Right-click the security folder and select New Login. On the general page, choose SQL Server authentication and enter the name of a user in the login name box. Type and confirm use password. On the user mapping pane, end your database and click OK. Now, open your database and open security and user folder. You will see your new user you've just created. Double-click on it and on membership page, add DB owner and click OK. You can do the same job using Transact SQL. In SQL Server Management Studio, open New Query command and type the following code. Create login, your username with password you want to use. Then new line to create user with the same username as you created as login name. Execute these commands and we can check results. When we open logins in security folder, we can see our new username. Now we need to add this new user to our database. When we finish with adding all credentials, we need to configure him as DB owner. If we have an NAV server instance configured as multi-tenant server instance, we have to complete the previous procedure on both of databases, on application and on the tenant database. Now we need to configure Microsoft Dynamics NAV server instance with the same credentials as we already used to log on database. Open Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2016 administration tool and find your instance. In Action pane, choose Database Credentials. Click Edit and change default authentication type to SQL Authentication. Type default username we have already created and his password. Click Save and OK after that on Enable Encryption on SQL Server Connection dialog box. Once more, read information why we use encryption key and click on OK. If you want to enable encryption on SQL Server connections, in the Action pane, choose Configuration and then choose the Edit button. In the Database tab, select Enable Encryption on SQL Connections, choose the Save button and then OK button. When we finished with all changes, we need to restart the server instance. You can do it the same using Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2016 administration shell. You need to use set NAV server configuration commandlet with the following parameters. And now we will configure Microsoft Dynamics NAV server instance with the same credentials for user accounts for the application and tenant databases in SQL Server as we already used to log on database. In multi-tenant environment, as prerequisite, we had to create users with SQL authentication on both databases, application and business data databases. Now we will use Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2016 administration tool again. Find your multi-tenant instance. In Action pane, choose Database Credentials. Click Edit and change default authentication type to SQL Authentication. Type default username we have already created and his password. Click Save and OK after that on Enable Encryption on SQL Server Connection dialog box. And click OK once more. As in the single-tenant environment, if you want to enable encryption on SQL Server connections, in the Action pane choose Configuration and then choose the Edit button. In the Database tab, select Enable Encryption on SQL Connection, choose the Save button and then the OK button. When we finished with all changes, we need Mount Tenants. Because we have already mounted tenants, we first have to dismount them. To do this, click on Tenant item in the left pane, mark one tenant and click on Dismount Tenant command in the right pane. Click OK and repeat it for all tenants. Now we need to mount them using Mount Tenant command in the right pane. Click and type the tenant ID, database name and database server. Click OK and restart the server instance. You can do it with PowerShell commands as well. You need to use dismount NAV tenant and mount NAV tenant commandlets. Now let's check if everything works. Run Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2016 Windows client and type our service with tenant. Now we open and everything is OK. Let's wrap up what I talked about. These were steps I followed. First, we configure an encryption key. Then we configure SQL Server authentication on the database. And on the end, we configured SQL authentication in single-tenant environment and in multi-tenant environment. With all these steps, I completed all steps in the process on configuration of creation SQL Server authentication between NAV instance and a database. To learn more about this topic, visit the Get Started page and follow the links in the screen. Thanks for watching this video about configuration of SQL Server Authentication in Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2016. This video in the How Do I series about Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2016 is prepared in collaboration of Microsoft and Platan.